The morning sun painted the Nebraska sky orange and pink, but Mary Ellen couldn't see the beauty anymore. She stood at the edge of her wheat field, dirt caked under her fingernails and sweat already beading on her forehead, even though the day had barely begun. The wooden plow handle felt rough in her hands, and she could feel new blisters forming on top of the old ones that never seemed to heal. 6 months. That's how long it had been since the coughing stopped echoing through their small farmhouse. 6 months since her husband Robert had taken his last breath, his hand growing cold in hers as tuberculosis finally claimed the man who had been her whole world. The doctor had warned them it was coming, but nothing could have prepared her for the silence that followed. The wheat field stretched out before her like an ocean of responsibility. 40 acres of Nebraska soil that had once seemed like a blessing now felt like a mountain she had to climb every single day. When Robert was alive, they had worked these fields together. He would guide the plow while she followed behind, planting seeds and pulling weeds. They had dreams back then. Dreams of expanding the farm, maybe buying the neighboring land, sending their children to school in town. Now those dreams felt as distant as the horizon. Her 8-year-old son Tommy came running from the house, his bare feet kicking up dust clouds with each step. His pants were too short, growing out of them faster than she could afford to replace them. Behind him trailed little Annie, just 4 years old, clutching a raggedy corn husk doll that Mary Ellen had made for her last winter. "Mama." "The mule won't listen to me," Tommy panted, pointing toward old Buck who stood stubbornly by the barn refusing to be harnessed. "I tried to put the collar on him like Papa used to, but he just walks away." Mary Ellen sighed and wiped her hands on her worn apron. Even the animals seemed to know that everything had changed. Buck had been Robert's mule, responding to his voice and his gentle but firm touch. Now the stubborn animal acted like he didn't recognize any of them. "Let me try, sweetheart," she said, forcing a smile for Tommy's sake. The boy was trying so hard to be the man of the house, but he was still just a child who should be playing with wooden toys instead of worrying about farm work. As they walked toward the barn, Mary Ellen noticed Mrs. Henderson from the neighboring farm hanging laundry on her line. The older woman glanced their way, and Mary Ellen could practically hear the thoughts running through her mind. The whole community had been watching since Robert's funeral, waiting to see how long the widow would last before giving up. A woman has no business trying to run a farm alone, she had overheard Mr. Peterson saying at the general store last week. "That land will be for sale before harvest time, mark my words." Those words stung because deep down Mary Ellen feared he might be right. Every morning brought new challenges that seemed impossible to solve. The plow was so heavy that she could barely guide it through the hard-packed earth. When it got stuck on rocks or roots, she had to stop everything and dig it out by hand while Tommy tried his best to keep Buck calm and steady. The physical work was crushing her. Her back ached from the moment she woke up until she collapsed into bed each night. Her shoulders burned from lifting water buckets and hay bales that Robert had made look effortless. Her hands were a mess of cuts and calluses, rough and raw from tools that seemed designed for someone twice her size and strength. But the emotional weight was even harder to bear. Every evening when she finally stopped working, she would sit on the front porch and look out at the fields that still needed so much work. The overwhelming loneliness would hit her like a physical blow. No one to share the daily struggles with. No one to help make decisions about when to plant or when to harvest. No one to hold her when she cried from exhaustion and fear. The children tried to help in their own ways. Tommy had taken over feeding the chickens and gathering eggs without being asked. He also helped with Buck when the mule was in a cooperative mood. Annie would sit quietly in the field while Mary Ellen worked, making up stories for her corn husk doll and sometimes bringing her mama wildflowers she had picked. But children shouldn't have to worry about whether there would be enough food for winter or if they might lose their home. Mary Ellen tried to hide her fears from them, but she knew Tommy was old enough to understand that things were not going well. She had seen him counting the coins in the jar on the kitchen shelf, the same jar that used to be full of their savings and now held only a few dollars. The bank letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by young Billy Walsh, who worked for the Postal Service. Mary Ellen's hands shook as she read the formal words that basically meant one thing: pay up or lose everything. The mortgage payment was 3 months behind, and Mr. Crawford at the bank was being as patient as he could. But patience didn't pay the bills. That night, after the children were asleep, Mary Ellen sat at the kitchen table with a pencil and paper, trying to make the numbers work. She added up what they might earn from this year's crop if everything went perfectly. She subtracted what they owed the bank, what they needed for seeds for next year, what they needed just to survive the winter. No matter how many times she did the math, it never came out right. She thought about her sister Catherine, who lived in Chicago. Catherine had written several times, offering to take in Mary Ellen and the children. "Come to the city," she had said. "There are jobs here for women. Factory work, cleaning houses, taking care of other people's children. It's not easy, but it's steady money." But leaving the farm felt like abandoning Robert's memory. This land was where they had built their life together. The farmhouse still smelled like his pipe tobacco. His tools still hung in the barn exactly where he had left them. The apple tree by the kitchen window was one he had planted for her on their first wedding anniversary. How could she just walk away from all of that? As autumn approached, Mary Ellen knew she was running out of time. The wheat needed to be harvested soon, but she wasn't sure she had the strength or the knowledge to do it properly. Robert had always handled the harvest, knowing exactly when the grain was ready and how to get the best price at the grain elevator in town. Every night she fell into bed completely exhausted, her body aching and her mind racing with worries. Every morning she forced herself to get up and try again, because giving up wasn't an option as long as her children needed her to fight. But deep in her heart, Mary Ellen was beginning to wonder if love and determination would be enough to save their little farm. The weight of loss wasn't just about missing Robert anymore. It was about losing everything they had built together, everything they had dreamed of leaving for their children. The fields that had once represented hope and possibility now felt like an impossible burden that grew heavier with each passing day. The rooster crowed at dawn, but Mary Ellen had been awake for hours already. Sleep came in short bursts these days, interrupted by worry and the constant ache in her back. She rolled out of bed, wincing as her feet hit the cold wooden floor, and quietly made her way to the kitchen to start the morning routine. Coffee was a luxury they could barely afford now, so she boiled water for chicory instead. The bitter taste reminded her every morning of how much their life had changed. While the water heated, she stepped outside to check on the animals. Old Buck stood in his stall looking as tired as she felt. The chickens pecked around their coop, at least providing them with eggs when they felt like laying. Tommy appeared in the doorway, already dressed and ready to help. The sight of him trying so hard to be grown up broke her heart a little more each day. No 8-year-old should have to worry about whether the family would have enough to eat, but she could see the concern in his young eyes. "Morning, Mama," he said quietly. "Should I get Buck ready for the field?" Mary Ellen nodded, grateful for his help but wishing he could just be a normal child. They worked together to harness the mule, a process that used to take Robert just a few minutes but now took them nearly half an hour. Buck seemed to sense their inexperience and took advantage of it, moving away just when they thought they had the collar positioned right. The plow itself was the biggest challenge. Made of heavy iron and wood, it had been designed for a man's strength. When Mary Ellen gripped the handles and tried to guide it through the soil, her arms shook from the effort. The blade would catch on rocks hidden beneath the surface, jolting her forward and sometimes knocking her off balance completely. Today was particularly difficult. The ground was harder than usual after several days without rain, and the plow kept getting stuck. Each time it happened, Mary Ellen had to stop everything, unhitch Buck, and use a shovel to dig around whatever was blocking their path. By mid-morning, she had only managed to plow 3 rows, and her hands were bleeding from gripping the rough wooden handles. Little Annie sat under the old oak tree at the edge of the field, talking to her cornhusk doll and occasionally calling out encouragement. "You can do it, Mama," she would shout, clapping her small hands. The innocent support from her 4-year-old daughter gave Mary Ellen strength to keep trying, even when every muscle in her body screamed for rest. Around noon, disaster struck. The plow hit something large buried in the soil, probably an old tree root, and the sudden stop sent Mary Ellen tumbling forward. She landed hard on her knees, skinning them through her already patched skirt. But worse than her scraped knees was the sound she heard next. A sharp crack from the plow. Tommy ran over to help her up, his face pale with worry. Together they examined the damage. One of the wooden handles had split nearly in half, making the plow impossible to use safely. Mary Ellen stared at the broken tool and felt tears burning her eyes. Without the plow, they couldn't finish preparing the fields. Without proper fields, there would be no crop. Without a crop, they would lose everything. "Can we fix it, Mama?" Tommy asked, his voice small and hopeful. Mary Ellen touched the split wood, knowing it would take more than hope to repair this kind of damage. It needed proper tools and skills that she didn't have. Robert would have known exactly what to do, probably could have had it fixed in an hour. But Robert wasn't here anymore, and she was running out of options. The afternoon brought more bad news. Mrs. Patterson from the neighboring farm stopped by, supposedly to check on them, but really to deliver gossip. She stood in the kitchen, accepting a cup of chicory while her eyes took in every detail of their increasingly sparse living conditions. "I heard the Johnsons sold their place last week," Mrs. Patterson said, stirring her drink slowly. "Couldn't make the payments after William hurt his back. They're moving to town looking for work at the lumber mill." Mary Ellen nodded politely, but she understood the real message. Mrs. Patterson was letting her know that other farming families were giving up, that there was no shame in admitting defeat. The older woman's eyes lingered on the broken plow leaning against the barn wall, visible through the kitchen window. "Of course they had help from his brothers," Mrs. Patterson continued. "Family makes all the difference in times like these. I suppose it's much harder when a woman is trying to manage alone." After Mrs. Patterson left, Mary Ellen sat at the kitchen table with her head in her hands. The weight of judgment from the community was almost as heavy as the physical work. People were watching her struggle, waiting to see when she would finally admit that she couldn't do it alone. That evening, she tried to repair the plow handle using some old wood scraps and nails she found in Robert's toolbox. But her makeshift fix only lasted about 10 minutes in the field the next morning before splitting again, this time in an even worse spot. The days blended together in a haze of exhaustion and frustration. Mary Ellen would work until her hands bled, take a break to tend to the children, then force herself back to the fields until darkness made it impossible to continue. She often worked by moonlight, determined to make progress even when she could barely see what she was doing. Tommy tried to help with the heavy work, but he was still just a child. Watching him strain to lift tools that were too big for him made Mary Ellen's heart ache. Annie would bring her wildflowers picked from the edges of the field, little gestures of love that kept Mary Ellen going when everything else felt hopeless. The neighbors' whispers grew louder. She overheard conversations at the general store about how long the poor widow would last before giving up. Some people seemed genuinely concerned, while others appeared to be placing bets on when she would finally sell the farm. One particularly difficult morning, after the makeshift plow handle broke for the third time, Mary Ellen found herself crying in the middle of the wheat field. She had sent Tommy to the house with Annie, not wanting them to see her breakdown. The broken plow lay beside her, useless and mocking. The partially planted field stretched out around her, a reminder of how far behind she had fallen. She thought about Catherine's letters again, the ones promising steady work in Chicago. Maybe it was time to admit that some battles couldn't be won through determination alone. Maybe the neighbors were right, and a woman really couldn't manage a farm by herself. But then she remembered Robert's hands teaching her how to read the soil, his voice explaining when the wheat was ready for harvest. This land held their entire history together. Giving up felt like erasing not just their future, but their past as well. As the sun began to set, Mary Ellen picked up the pieces of the broken plow and walked slowly back to the farmhouse. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but she wasn't ready to surrender yet. Even if she didn't know how she would overcome the obstacles ahead, she knew she had to keep trying for as long as strength remained in her body. The struggle was deepening, but her resolve, though tested, had not yet broken. The heat was unbearable that July morning. Even the grasshoppers seemed too tired to jump, and the air shimmered like water above the dusty ground. Mary Ellen knelt beside the broken plow, her dress soaked with sweat as she tried once again to repair the handle that kept splitting. The wood was old and dry, refusing to hold together no matter how many nails she hammered into it. Tommy sat in the shade nearby, fanning himself with his hat while keeping an eye on Annie, who was unusually quiet in the oppressive heat. The little girl had wilted like a flower, her usual chatter replaced by sleepy murmurs to her corn husk doll. Even old Buck stood motionless in whatever shade he could find, his tail occasionally swishing at flies but otherwise conserving his energy. Mary Ellen wiped sweat from her forehead with the back of her wrist, leaving a streak of dirt across her skin. The plow handle had broken again this morning, right where she had tried to reinforce it with a metal bracket salvaged from an old barrel. Each failed repair felt like another step toward defeat, another sign that she was fighting a battle she couldn't win. She was so focused on her work, muttering under her breath about stubborn wood and impossible situations, that she didn't notice the rider approaching from the east until Tommy called out, "Mama, someone's coming." Mary Ellen looked up, squinting against the bright sun. A lone horseman was making his way down the dusty road that led past their farm. In this part of Nebraska, visitors were rare enough to be noteworthy, and strangers were even more unusual. Most folks who traveled this way were neighbors she recognized or traveling salesmen with their loaded wagons. This man was different. He sat tall and easy in his saddle, moving with the natural rhythm of someone who had spent countless hours on horseback. His horse was a beautiful chestnut mare, clearly well cared for and strong. Even from a distance, Mary Ellen could see the confidence in the way he carried himself, the kind of quiet assurance that came from a life spent outdoors and in control of his own destiny. As he drew closer, she could make out more details. He wore a wide-brimmed hat that shaded his face, and his clothes were the practical kind favored by working men. Sturdy pants, a cotton shirt, and a vest that had seen better days, but was still serviceable. Leather chaps protected his legs, and she could see the worn handles of tools hanging from his saddle. Mary Ellen stood up slowly, suddenly aware of how she must look. Her dress was dirty and sweat-stained, her hair escaping from the bun she had hastily pinned that morning. Her hands were grimy from wrestling with the plow, and she probably smelled like hard work and desperation. She smoothed her skirt self-consciously and called Tommy and Annie to come closer. The rider slowed his horse as he approached the fence line, touching the brim of his hat in a polite greeting. His face was weathered from sun and wind, with laugh lines around his eyes and a strong jaw that spoke of determination. He looked to be somewhere in his 30s, old enough to have experience but young enough to still have the energy for hard work. "Good morning, ma'am," he said, his voice carrying easily across the distance between them. There was a slight drawl to his words, suggesting he had come from somewhere south of Nebraska. "I hope I'm not disturbing you, but I was wondering if I might trouble you for some water for my horse. We've been traveling since before dawn, and she's getting mighty thirsty in this heat." Mary Ellen hesitated for just a moment. Robert had always taught her to be cautious around strangers, especially when she was alone with the children. But hospitality was a sacred duty on the frontier, where the next source of water might be many miles away. Besides, something about this man's polite manner and respectful distance put her more at ease than she had expected. "Of course," she replied, gesturing toward the well near the house. "Please help yourself. There's a bucket and rope right there." The man dismounted with fluid grace, moving like someone who had been riding horses since childhood. He led his mare to the well, speaking softly to her in words Mary Ellen couldn't quite make out, but that sounded gentle and reassuring. The horse nuzzled his shoulder affectionately, clearly trusting her rider completely. As he worked the well pump, the stranger glanced around the farmyard with the practiced eye of someone who understood agricultural life. Mary Ellen noticed him taking in the partially plowed field, the broken equipment, and the general air of struggle that hung over the place like dust. But his expression remained neutral and respectful, showing no judgment or pity. Tommy, always curious about new people, edged closer to get a better look at the visitor and his horse. The man noticed the boy's interest and smiled. "She's a beauty, isn't she?" he said, patting the mare's neck. "Her name is Star, on account of that white mark on her forehead. She's been my partner for going on 5 years now. Haven't found a more reliable traveling companion anywhere." "Where are you headed?" Tommy asked, emboldened by the stranger's friendly manner. "Wyoming territory," the man replied, continuing to let the horse drink from the bucket. "Got word there might be work on some of the big ranches up that way. Cattle driving, maybe some ranch hand work through the winter." Mary Ellen found herself studying the stranger more closely as he talked with Tommy. There was something about his manner that reminded her of Robert. The same quiet confidence, the same respect for animals, the same way of speaking that made you feel like you were talking to an old friend rather than someone you had just met. He introduced himself as Daniel Cooper, a cowboy who had been working his way north from Texas after finishing a cattle drive in Kansas. He spoke easily about life on the trail, about the different ranches where he had worked, about the changing landscape as settlements pushed further west. His stories painted pictures of wide open spaces and endless skies, of working under stars and sleeping on the ground. of a life that was hard but free. Annie, initially shy, was gradually drawn into the conversation by Daniel's gentle manner and the way he talked to Star as if the horse was a person. When the little girl finally approached, Daniel crouched down to her level and asked about her cornhusk doll, listening seriously as she explained the doll's name and personality. "That's fine handiwork," he said, examining the doll with genuine interest. "Someone who made this knows their way around a needle and thread." "Mama made it for me," Annie said proudly, beaming at the compliment. Daniel looked up at Mary Ellen with approval. "A woman who can make toys and work a farm too. That's impressive." The comment made Mary Ellen blush, though whether from pleasure at the compliment or embarrassment at the state of her farm, she wasn't sure. It had been a long time since anyone had noticed her efforts or acknowledged the difficulty of what she was trying to accomplish. As Star finished drinking, Daniel began to prepare for departure. But his eyes kept drifting to the broken plow lying in the dirt, and Mary Ellen could see the wheels turning in his mind. He was clearly someone who understood tools and equipment, probably someone who had fixed his share of broken things during his travels. "That plow giving you trouble?" he asked finally, nodding toward the damaged handle. Mary Ellen felt heat rise in her cheeks. "It keeps breaking," she admitted. "I've tried to fix it several times, but the wood is old and I don't have the right tools." Daniel walked over to examine the plow more closely, running his hands along the split handle and testing the strength of the metal blade. His touch was sure and knowledgeable, the hands of someone who had worked with tools and machinery his entire life. "This is good equipment," he said after a moment. "The blade is still sharp and the frame is solid. The handle just needs proper repair, maybe some reinforcement." He looked up at Mary Ellen with a thoughtful expression. "I passed a blacksmith shop about 5 miles back toward town. Fellow there could probably fashion a new handle or at least strengthen this one properly." The suggestion hung in the air between them. Mary Ellen wanted to accept his help, but pride and financial reality held her back. She couldn't afford to pay a blacksmith, and she couldn't afford to hire someone to transport the plow to town and back. Daniel seemed to understand her hesitation without being told the reasons for it. He straightened up and touched the brim of his hat again, preparing to mount his horse. "Thank you kindly for the water, ma'am," he said. "Your hospitality is much appreciated." As he swung into the saddle, Mary Ellen felt an unexpected pang of disappointment. In the short time he had been there, Daniel Cooper had brought a sense of calm competence to their struggling farm. His presence had made everything feel more manageable, more hopeful. But he was a drifter, a cowboy with his own destination and his own life to live. She had no right to expect anything more from him than the courtesy he had already shown. Mary Ellen stood in the farmyard long after Daniel Cooper had ridden away, watching until his figure disappeared into the shimmering heat waves that rose from the dusty road. Something about the cowboy's brief visit had stirred feelings she hadn't experienced in months. Not romantic feelings exactly, but something deeper. The memory of what it felt like to have capable help, to not carry every burden alone. Tommy kicked at the dirt, clearly disappointed that the interesting visitor had left. "I liked him, Mama," he said. "He knew a lot about horses and farming stuff." Annie clutched her cornhusk doll tighter, as if the stranger's approval had made the toy more precious. "He said you were impressive," she told her mother with the matter-of-fact honesty of a 4-year-old. Mary Ellen smiled despite herself. It had been a long time since anyone had called her impressive. Most days she felt anything but impressive, just tired and overwhelmed and constantly worried about making the wrong decisions. But for a few minutes, seeing herself through Daniel Cooper's eyes, she had felt capable again. The rest of the morning dragged by in the oppressive heat. Without a working plow, there wasn't much Mary Ellen could accomplish in the fields. She tried to use a hoe to break up some of the harder soil, but it was slow, back-breaking work that barely made a dent in what needed to be done. By noon, she had managed to prepare maybe a 1/4 acre, when she needed to plant several acres before the season got any later. The children helped as much as they could, but the heat was getting to all of them. Annie wilted like a flower, spending most of the morning lying in whatever shade she could find. Tommy tried to stay busy, but even his 8-year-old energy was no match for the blazing sun. By early afternoon, Mary Ellen called it quits and sent everyone inside for the hottest part of the day. She was preparing a simple lunch of cornbread and the last of their preserved vegetables when she heard hoofbeats in the yard again. Through the kitchen window, she saw Daniel Cooper riding up to the house, and her heart did a little skip that she tried to ignore. Behind him, tied to his saddle, was her broken plow. Mary Ellen hurried outside, wiping her hands on her apron. "Mr. Cooper," she called, surprised by how glad she was to see him again. "I thought you were heading to Wyoming." Daniel dismounted and began untying the plow from his saddle. "I was, ma'am, but I got to thinking about this piece of equipment and decided to make a little detour. I hope you don't mind, but I took the liberty of stopping by that blacksmith I mentioned. Fellow named Henderson seems to know his business." Mary Ellen stared at the plow in amazement. The handle had been completely rebuilt, reinforced with metal brackets that looked both strong and professionally made. The wood itself was new, smooth, and properly shaped for a woman's smaller hands. Even the blade had been sharpened and oiled until it gleamed. "Mr. Cooper, I can't possibly pay for this," she said, her voice tight with emotion. "I appreciate the kindness, but I don't have money for blacksmith work." Daniel continued untying the plow, not meeting her eyes. "Funny thing about that," he said in a casual tone. "Turns out Henderson owed me a favor from way back. I helped him out of a tight spot a few years ago, and he's been telling me ever since that he wanted to return the kindness. When I explained the situation, he was happy to do the work." Mary Ellen wasn't sure she believed this story, but the cowboy's matter-of-fact delivery made it hard to argue. "Even so," she said, "I should pay you something for your time and trouble." "No, ma'am, that's not necessary," Daniel replied firmly. "Where I come from, neighbors help neighbors. Doesn't matter if you've known someone for 20 years or 20 minutes. When someone needs help and you can provide it, you do." Tommy had come running from the house at the sound of voices, and now he was examining the repaired plow with obvious admiration. "Look at that, Mama! It's like new, but even better." Daniel smiled at the boy's enthusiasm. "Want to test it out? See how she handles?" Before Mary Ellen could object, Daniel was already hitching Old Buck to the repaired plow. The mule, perhaps sensing that this man knew what he was doing, cooperated without his usual stubborn resistance. Within minutes, Daniel had the equipment ready for field work. "May I?" he asked, gesturing toward the partially prepared field. Mary Ellen nodded, curious to see how the plow would perform with its new handle. Daniel took hold of the grips with easy confidence and began cutting a furrow through the soil. The difference was immediately obvious. The new handle was balanced and strong, moving smoothly through the dirt without the jarring resistance that had made the work so difficult for Mary Ellen. But it wasn't just the improved equipment that made the work look easier. Daniel had clearly spent years behind a plow, understanding exactly how to guide it for maximum efficiency with minimum effort. He moved with the rhythm of someone who had done this work countless times, making straight, even furrows that would be perfect for planting. "The key is letting the plow do the work," he called over his shoulder to Tommy, who was following along behind like an eager apprentice. "Don't fight the soil, work with it. Feel for the rocks and roots before they catch the blade." Mary Ellen found herself mesmerized by the sight of proper plowing. In just 20 minutes, Daniel had accomplished more than she typically managed in half a day of struggle. The field that had seemed impossible was beginning to look manageable again. When he reached the end of the row, Daniel paused and looked back at his work with satisfaction. "She handles beautifully now," he said, patting the plow like it was a favorite horse. "Henderson did fine work on that handle. Should last you many seasons." "I don't know how to thank you," Mary Ellen said, and she meant it. The kindness from this stranger was overwhelming, especially after months of feeling like the whole world was watching her fail. "No thanks necessary," Daniel replied, "though I have to say this is some fine farmland. Good soil, decent drainage, plenty of room for expansion. Your husband had a good eye for property." The mention of Robert brought a familiar pang of loss, but somehow it didn't hurt as much as usual. Maybe it was because Daniel spoke of him with respect, recognizing the wisdom and choices Robert had made rather than focusing on his absence. "He loved this land," Mary Ellen said softly. "We had so many plans for it." Daniel nodded with understanding. "Plans have a way of changing, but good land endures. The important thing is not giving up on it." As the afternoon wore on, Daniel showed no signs of being in a hurry to leave. He helped Tommy learn to harness Buck properly, showing the boy tricks for working with stubborn mules. He examined the barn and suggested some simple repairs that would keep the roof from leaking when the rains came. He even spent time with Annie, listening seriously as she told him elaborate stories about her corn husk doll's adventures. When evening approached, Mary Ellen found herself hoping he would stay for supper. The thought surprised her with its intensity. It had been so long since she had enjoyed adult conversation, so long since someone had been around who could handle the heavy work that exhausted her. "Mr. Cooper," she said finally, gathering her courage, "would you consider staying for supper? It's not much, but it's the least I can offer after everything you've done." Daniel hesitated, and for a moment Mary Ellen thought he would decline. Then he smiled, the kind of warm, genuine smile that made his whole face light up. "That's very kind of you, ma'am. I'd be honored to accept." As Mary Ellen hurried to the house to prepare the meal, she felt lighter than she had in months. For the first time since Robert's death, she wasn't facing the evening alone. There would be conversation at the dinner table, someone to share the daily stories and small victories with. She didn't dare think beyond tonight, didn't let herself imagine what it might mean if Daniel chose to stay longer. But for now, for this evening, she had help and companionship, and that was enough to make her feel hopeful again. The plow stood in the field ready for tomorrow's work, its new handle gleaming in the setting sun like a promise that better days might be ahead. Mary Ellen woke before dawn to the sound of someone moving around in the barn. For a heart-stopping moment, she thought it might be thieves or drifters. But then she remembered that Daniel Cooper had asked permission to sleep in the hayloft rather than ride on in the dark after supper. The relief that flooded through her was followed immediately by embarrassment. She had overslept, something that never happened anymore. And their guest was probably wondering why the farm family wasn't up and working yet. She dressed quickly in her worn work dress and hurried outside, expecting to find Daniel saddling his horse for departure. Instead, she found him examining old Buck with the careful attention of someone who understood animals. The mule stood patiently while Daniel checked his hooves and ran his hands along his legs, testing for soundness. "Good morning, ma'am," Daniel said when he noticed her approach. "I hope I didn't wake you. Buck here seems to be favoring his left front foot a little. Nothing serious, just a small stone caught in his shoe. I worked it out for you." Mary Ellen stared at him, processing what she was seeing. Daniel had not only tended to their mule, but he had already fed and watered all the animals. The chickens were pecking contentedly around the yard, and she could see fresh hay in Buck's stall. It was the kind of morning routine that Robert used to handle, tasks that had fallen to her and made every day feel overwhelming before it even began. "Mr. Cooper, you didn't need to do all that," she said, though gratitude colored her voice. "You've already done so much for us." Daniel straightened up and brushed his hands on his pants. "Force of habit, I suppose. On the trail, you take care of the animals before you take care of yourself. Figured it was the least I could do after your hospitality last night." Tommy came running from the house, already dressed and ready for the day. The boy had clearly been watching from the window, excited to see their visitor again. Behind him came Annie, still in her nightgown but clutching her cornhusk doll and eager to join whatever was happening. "Are you leaving now?" Tommy asked, trying to hide his disappointment. Daniel glanced toward the partially plowed field, then back at the family. "Well, I've been thinking about that," he said slowly. "This crop needs to get in the ground soon, or you'll miss the planting season entirely. Seems a shame to let good farmland go to waste when a little extra work could make all the difference." Mary Ellen felt her heart skip. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying maybe Wyoming can wait a few more days," Daniel replied. "If you'll have me, I'd like to help you get this field planted proper. No sense in fixing a plow if there's no one with the strength to use it effectively." The offer hung in the air between them. Mary Ellen wanted to accept immediately, but years of making difficult decisions alone had taught her to be cautious. "Mr. Cooper, I appreciate the offer more than you know, but I can't pay you for farm work. We're barely keeping our heads above water as it is." Daniel waved off her concern. "I'm not looking for payment, ma'am. Just asking for a place to sleep and maybe a share of whatever meals you're preparing. I've got enough saved up to last me through to Wyoming. Consider it a vacation from trail work." Before Mary Ellen could respond, Daniel was already walking toward the field. "Besides," he called over his shoulder, "I've been wanting to test out the work Henderson did on that plow handle. Can't do that properly without putting in a full day's work." Mary Ellen stood frozen for a moment, watching as Daniel began hitching Buck to the repaired plow. Part of her wanted to protest, to maintain her independence and prove she could handle everything alone. But a larger part, the practical part that understood how desperately she needed help, recognized this as the answer to prayers she had been afraid to voice. Tommy was already running after Daniel, eager to help and learn. Annie followed more slowly, but with equal determination not to be left out. Watching her children gravitate toward this kind stranger, Mary Ellen made her decision. "Tommy, come help me with breakfast," she called. "Mr. Cooper will be hungry after all that work." Daniel looked back at her with a smile that seemed to light up the early morning. "Yes, ma'am. And please call me Daniel. Mr. Cooper makes me sound older than I feel." Within an hour, Daniel was working the field with a skill and efficiency that took Mary Ellen's breath away. The plow moved through the soil like it was cutting through butter, creating perfect furrows that would be ideal for planting. Buck seemed to sense that an experienced hand was guiding the work, responding to Daniel's voice commands and gentle guidance with none of the stubborn resistance he usually showed. Mary Ellen tried to continue with her usual morning tasks, but she found herself constantly drawn back to watching Daniel work. There was something almost hypnotic about the steady rhythm of proper plowing, the way he moved with the natural contours of the land, never fighting the soil but working with it. "Now rest," Daniel called to her when he noticed her watching. He gestured toward the shade of the old oak tree at the edge of the field. "No sense in both of us working ourselves to exhaustion in this heat." The suggestion felt foreign to Mary Ellen, who hadn't truly rested during daylight hours since Robert's death. There was always something that needed doing, always another task demanding her attention. But Daniel's tone carried gentle authority, and she found herself obeying before she could think of reasons to refuse. Sitting in the shade with Annie playing nearby, Mary Ellen allowed herself to really watch Daniel work. He moved with the confident ease of someone who had spent his life doing physical labor, but there was also an intelligence to his approach. He could read the soil, adjusting his technique for harder or softer ground, avoiding obvious obstacles, maintaining perfectly straight rows without needing to stop and check his work. Tommy had appointed himself as Daniel's assistant, running back and forth with water and helping to clear rocks from the plow's path. The boy was clearly absorbing every detail, asking questions about technique and timing. Daniel answered patiently, explaining the reasons behind each decision he made. "See how the soil looks here?" Daniel called to Tommy, pausing at the end of a row. "It's darker and holds together better. That means it's got good moisture and nutrients. This is prime farmland, Tommy. Your papa chose well when he settled here." By midday, Daniel had accomplished more than Mary Ellen typically managed in a week of struggle. The difference wasn't just in physical strength, though that was certainly part of it. Daniel understood farming in a way that came from years of experience, knowing instinctively how to work efficiently and effectively. When the sun reached its peak, Daniel unhitched Buck and led him to the shade for rest and water. He was sweating from the hard work, his shirt damp and his hat pushed back on his head, but he looked satisfied rather than exhausted. "Good morning's work," he said, accepting the jar of cool water Mary Ellen brought him. "At this pace, we'll have the whole field ready for planting by the end of the week." The casual use of "we" sent a warmth through Mary Ellen that had nothing to do with the summer heat. It had been so long since she was part of a team, since someone else shared the responsibility for making important decisions about the farm. "Daniel," she said carefully, "I need you to understand something. We're not just struggling with the work. We're behind on the mortgage payments. Even if we get a good crop this year, there's no guarantee we'll be able to keep the farm." Daniel looked at her seriously, setting down the water jar. "How far behind?" 3 months, Mary Ellen admitted, the words painful to speak aloud. "The bank is being patient, but Mr. Crawford says he can't wait much longer." "What do you figure the crop is worth if everything goes right?" Mary Ellen had done this math so many times she knew it by heart. Maybe enough to catch up on what we owe and have a little left over for seed next year. But that's if the weather cooperates, if we get a good price at market, if nothing goes wrong. Daniel nodded thoughtfully. A lot of ifs in farming. But good soil and hard work stack the odds in your favor, and sometimes a person just has to bet on themselves and see what happens. He stood up and dusted off his hands. "Well then, we better make sure this is the best crop this land has ever produced. No sense in doing things halfway." As Daniel returned to work, Mary Ellen felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Not the desperate, fragile hope that had kept her going through the darkest days, but real, practical hope based on seeing what was possible when capable hands took hold of an impossible situation. For the first time since Robert's death, she began to believe that maybe, just maybe, they might actually make it through this crisis. And it was all because a cowboy passing through had decided that Wyoming could wait a little longer. 3 days passed before Mary Ellen fully realized that Daniel Cooper wasn't leaving anytime soon. What had started as a simple offer to help with plowing had evolved into something much larger. Each morning, she would wake to find him already tending to the animals and checking the equipment. Each evening, he would wash up at the pump and join them for supper, as if he had always been part of their family routine. The transformation of the farm was remarkable. Under Daniel's experienced guidance, tasks that had seemed impossible became manageable. The field that Mary Ellen had been struggling with for weeks was now completely prepared and planted, with neat rows of wheat seeds tucked into the rich Nebraska soil. But it wasn't just the field work that made the difference. Daniel seemed to see everything that needed attention and quietly set about fixing it. The barn roof, which had been leaking since the spring rains, was now weatherproof thanks to new shingles Daniel had shaped himself from scraps of wood. The chicken coop had a new door that actually stayed closed, protecting their hens from foxes and other predators. Even the farmhouse itself benefited from his attention. Loose floorboards were nailed down, a broken window was patched, and the kitchen pump that had been getting harder to work each day now moved smoothly. But perhaps the most significant change was in the children. Tommy had attached himself to Daniel like a shadow, absorbing every lesson about farming, animal care, and basic carpentry. The boy's confidence was growing daily as he learned skills that would serve him well in rural life. Daniel never talked down to him or treated him like a child, instead explaining the reasoning behind each task and letting Tommy help with real, important work. Annie, initially shy around the tall stranger, had gradually warmed to Daniel's gentle manner. He would listen seriously to her elaborate stories about her corn-husk doll's adventures, asking thoughtful questions that encouraged her imagination. In the evenings, he would whittle small toys from scraps of wood, creating a collection of animals that Annie treasured as much as her original doll. Mary Ellen found herself looking forward to mealtimes in a way she hadn't since Robert's death. Daniel was an easy conversationalist, sharing stories from his travels without dominating the conversation. He seemed genuinely interested in hearing about their life before the farm, about Robert's plans and dreams, about the challenges of raising children alone. "Your husband sounds like he was a good man," Daniel said one evening as they sat on the front porch after supper. The children were playing in the yard, their laughter carrying on the warm summer air. "Takes vision to see the potential in raw land like this." "He was," Mary Ellen replied softly. He could look at this place and see things that wouldn't exist for years. The apple orchard he wanted to plant over by the creek. The additional barn we planned to build when we could afford it. Sometimes I think he loved the farm more than anything else in the world. "Including you?" Daniel asked gently. Mary Ellen considered the question seriously. No, not more than me and the children. But it was all connected in his mind. The farm was how he planned to take care of us, how he wanted to build a legacy for Tommy and Annie. Losing it feels like losing him all over again. Daniel nodded with understanding. "I can see why you'd fight so hard to keep it. But I think your husband would be proud of what you've accomplished here. Keeping a farm running alone is no small thing, especially with children to care for." These conversations revealed layers to Daniel that Mary Ellen hadn't expected. Despite his nomadic lifestyle, he understood the deep connection that could exist between a family and their land. He spoke knowledgeably about crop rotation, soil conservation, and long-term planning in ways that suggested he had once thought about settling down himself. "Have you ever owned land?" Mary Ellen asked one evening as they watched the sun set over their newly planted fields. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, his fingers absently working a piece of wood he was carving for Annie. "Once," he said finally. "Had a little spread down in Texas near where I grew up. Nothing as fine as this, but it was mine. What happened to it?" "Drought," Daniel replied simply. 3 years without decent rain. Lost the cattle first, then couldn't make the payments on the land. Had to sell out to a bigger rancher for about half what I'd paid." He paused in his carving, his expression distant. "That's when I took to cowboy work, following the herds where the grass was better." Mary Ellen felt a surge of sympathy for the quiet pain in his voice. "Do you miss it? Having your own place?" "Every day," Daniel admitted. But missing something and being bitter about losing it are two different things. Life has a way of closing some doors and opening others. The trick is recognizing the opportunities when they come along. As the days passed, Mary Ellen began to rely on Daniel's judgment about farm decisions. When should they start watching for signs of germination in the wheat? How much hay would they need to cut for winter feed? Which repairs should take priority before the autumn rains arrived? His answers were always thoughtful and practical, based on years of experience with agriculture and animal husbandry. But it was the small gestures that meant the most to Mary Ellen. The way Daniel would take over the heavy lifting without being asked. How he always seemed to notice when she was struggling with a task and would quietly appear to help. The respect he showed for Robert's memory, often asking what her husband had planned or how he had handled certain situations. One morning, Mary Ellen woke to find Daniel splitting firewood behind the house, building up their supply for the coming winter. The rhythmic sound of the axe had worked its way into her dreams, creating a sense of security she hadn't felt in months. When she stepped outside with a cup of coffee for him, she found him pausing in his work to show Tommy the proper technique for wielding an axe safely. The key is letting the weight of the axe do the work, Daniel was explaining. You guide it, but you don't force it. Try to split the wood with the grain, not against it. Tommy nodded seriously, absorbing every word. At 8 years old, he was still too young to handle a full-sized axe. But Daniel had found him a smaller hatchet that was perfect for learning the basics of wood splitting. Mr. Daniel, Tommy said, using the title he had settled on for their guest, will you teach me how to shoe a horse? Buck doesn't need shoeing right now, Daniel replied, but next time he does, I'll show you how it's done. It's a useful skill for a young man to have. Mary Ellen watched this exchange with mixed emotions. She was grateful that Tommy was learning practical skills from an experienced man, but she was also beginning to worry about what would happen when Daniel eventually continued his journey to Wyoming. The children were becoming attached to him, and if she was honest with herself, so was she. That evening, as they sat on the porch after another productive day, Mary Ellen decided to address her concerns directly. Daniel, she said carefully, I need to ask you something and I want you to give me an honest answer. Always, he replied, setting down the piece of wood he was carving. How long are you planning to stay? The children are getting used to having you here and I don't want them to be hurt when you leave for Wyoming. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, considering his response. Truth is, ma'am, I've been asking myself the same question. When I first stopped here, I figured I'd help with the plow and be on my way within a day or two. But this place, your family, it's got a hold on me I didn't expect. What does that mean? Mary Ellen asked, her heart beating faster. It means Wyoming doesn't seem as important as it did a week ago. Daniel said softly, it means I wake up every morning looking forward to the work here, to seeing Tommy learn something new, to hearing Annie's stories. It means I'm starting to think about what might happen if I stayed instead of leaving. Mary Ellen felt tears spring to her eyes, though whether from relief or joy or fear, she couldn't say. And what do you think might happen? Daniel turned to look at her directly, his expression serious but warm. I think we might build something good here together. Not just the farm, but a real family. I think your children need a father figure. And I think you need a partner who understands what this land means to you. The words hung in the evening air between them, full of possibility and promise. Mary Ellen looked out at the fields where green shoots were just beginning to emerge from the soil, evidence of new life taking root. Maybe it was time to believe that some dreams, even when they looked different than originally planned, could still come true. August arrived with a gentle warmth that seemed to wrap around the farm like a comfortable blanket. The wheat field that had been Mary Ellen's greatest source of worry just months earlier now stretched before them in waves of gold and green, promising the best harvest the land had ever produced. Every morning Daniel would walk through the rows, checking the progress of the grain, running the kernels between his fingers to test their firmness, and calculating when the crop would be ready for cutting. Another 2 weeks, maybe 3, he announced one morning as the family gathered for breakfast. The grain needs to fill out just a little more, but this is going to be a fine harvest. Better than fine, actually. I'd say exceptional. Tommy beamed with pride as if he had personally grown every stalk of wheat. In many ways, he had earned that pride. Throughout the summer, he had worked alongside Daniel, learning not just the mechanics of farming, but the deeper rhythms of agricultural life. He could now harness Buck without help, recognize the signs of plant disease, and estimate crop yields with surprising accuracy for an 8-year-old. Annie had flourished as well, her confidence growing under Daniel's patient attention. She had taken over the job of collecting eggs from the chicken coop, a responsibility she approached with serious dedication. Her collection of hand-carved wooden animals had grown throughout the summer, each one a masterpiece of simple craftsmanship that Daniel had whittled during quiet evening hours. Mary Ellen found herself marveling at how natural it all felt. Daniel had integrated into their family routine so seamlessly that it was hard to remember what life had been like before his arrival. He was up before dawn each day, tending to the animals and checking the equipment. He worked through the morning heat, took midday rest when the sun was too intense, then returned to field work in the cooler evening hours. His presence had brought a sense of security and competence that had been missing since Robert's death. But as the harvest approached, Mary Ellen found herself thinking more and more about the future. Daniel had been with them for nearly 2 months now, and while he had mentioned several times that Wyoming could wait, she knew he had his own dreams and plans to consider. The idea of him leaving, especially now when everything seemed to be working so well, filled her with a dread she tried to keep hidden. The financial picture was improving dramatically. Daniel's expert care had resulted in a wheat crop that would easily cover their debts and leave enough money for next year's seed and basic living expenses. For the first time since Robert's death, Mary Ellen could see a path forward that didn't involve losing the farm. But that path seemed to require Daniel's continued presence, and she wasn't sure she had the right to ask him to abandon his original plans. One evening, as they sat on the front porch watching the children chase fireflies in the gathering dusk, Mary Ellen decided to broach the subject that had been weighing on her mind. "Daniel," she said carefully, "I've been thinking about what happens after the harvest." Daniel looked up from the piece of wood he was carving, a small horse that was destined to join Annie's growing menagerie. "What about it?" "Well, you came here heading to Wyoming for ranch work. Once we get the wheat in and sold, there's no reason you couldn't continue your journey. The fall would actually be perfect timing for finding winter work on a cattle ranch." Daniel set down his carving and knife, giving her his full attention. "Is that what you want? For me to move on?" Mary Ellen struggled with how to answer. What she wanted was for him to stay forever, to become the permanent partner and father figure that her family so desperately needed. But she also wanted him to choose that freely, not out of obligation or misplaced charity. "I want you to do what's best for you," she said finally. "You've already done more for us than we had any right to expect. I don't want you to feel trapped here because we've become dependent on your help." Daniel was quiet for a long moment, watching Tommy show Annie how to cup fireflies gently in her hands before releasing them unharmed. "You know," he said eventually, "when I first started traveling, I thought freedom meant never staying in one place long enough to put down roots. I figured that as long as I kept moving, I'd never have to face the kind of loss I experienced in Texas. And now," Mary Ellen prompted gently, "now I'm thinking that maybe real freedom isn't about avoiding attachments. Maybe it's about choosing the right ones." He turned to look at her directly, his expression serious but warm. "This place, your family, it feels more like home than anywhere I've been since I lost my own land. The work here matters in a way that drifting from ranch to ranch never did." Mary Ellen felt her heart flutter with hope, but she forced herself to be practical. "Daniel, I need you to understand something. We're not completely out of the woods financially. Even with a good harvest, farming is always uncertain. There could be drought years or pest problems or market prices that don't cover our costs. I can't promise you the kind of secure future that a steady ranch job might provide." Daniel smiled, reaching over to take her hand in his work-roughened one. "Mary Ellen, I've been thinking about this for weeks now. I've saved enough money from my cowboy work to help us expand this operation. We could buy some cattle, maybe lease additional land for pasture. With good management, this farm could support a real family instead of just barely getting by." The touch of his hand sent warmth up Mary Ellen's arm. But more than that, his words painted a picture of possibilities she had barely dared to imagine. "You've really thought this through." "I have," Daniel confirmed. "And I've thought about something else too. About how much I've come to care for all of you. About how Tommy lights up when he masters a new skill. And how Annie's stories make me laugh every single day. About how working beside you feels like the most natural thing in the world." Mary Ellen's breath caught in her throat. They were approaching territory that neither of them had explicitly acknowledged before, though the growing attraction between them had been impossible to ignore. "What are you saying?" she whispered. "I'm saying that Wyoming was just a destination, but this place, this family, could be a home. I'm saying that if you'll have me, I'd like to stay not just for the harvest, but for all the harvests to come." Before Mary Ellen could respond, Tommy came running up to the porch, his face flushed with excitement from chasing fireflies. "Mr. Daniel." Annie caught 3 fireflies at once. "You should have seen it." Daniel laughed and ruffled the boy's hair. "That's quite an accomplishment. Your sister's getting to be quite the expert firefly hunter." As the children settled down for their bedtime routine, Mary Ellen found herself watching Daniel with new eyes. She had grown accustomed to his presence, but now she was allowing herself to truly imagine a future with him as more than just a helpful friend. The idea was both thrilling and terrifying. Later that night, after the children were asleep, Mary Ellen and Daniel found themselves alone on the porch again. The conversation about the future hung between them, unfinished but full of promise. "Daniel," Mary Ellen said softly, "if you're serious about staying, about building a life here, then I need to tell you something." "What's that?" "I've come to care for you too. More than I thought possible after losing Robert. The idea of you leaving breaks my heart, but the idea of you staying just out of obligation would be even worse." Daniel reached for her hand again, this time holding it firmly in both of his. "Mary Ellen, there's no obligation here except the one I feel to my own heart. What I feel for you, for Tommy and Annie, for this land. It's not charity or duty. It's love, plain and simple." The word hung in the air between them, powerful and transformative. Mary Ellen felt tears spring to her eyes, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. "Then stay," she whispered. "Stay and help us build something beautiful here." Daniel lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "Wild horses couldn't drag me away," he said with a smile that made her heart sing. As they sat together in the warm Nebraska night, surrounded by the sounds of their thriving farm and the promise of golden wheat ready for harvest, Mary Ellen allowed herself to believe that sometimes when everything seems lost, life has a way of sending exactly what you need in the form of a cowboy, who knows that the best journey isn't to a distant destination, but to a place where love can grow as surely as grain in good soil. The morning of the harvest dawned clear and bright, with just enough breeze to keep the heat bearable. Mary Ellen woke before sunrise, not from worry for the first time in over a year, but from excitement. Today would mark the end of their struggle and the beginning of something entirely new. Daniel was already up, as usual, but this morning he was preparing the scythe and gathering basket with special care. The wheat was perfect, golden and heavy with grain, ready to be transformed from growing crop to life-sustaining harvest. Tommy had been counting down the days like a child waiting for Christmas, and even little Annie seemed to understand that something important was happening. "Today's the day," Daniel announced as they gathered for breakfast. "That wheat is calling to us and we better answer before the weather changes." The harvest work was hard but satisfying. Daniel wielded the scythe with practiced efficiency, cutting the grain stalks in smooth rhythmic strokes. Mary Ellen and Tommy followed behind, gathering the cut wheat into bundles that would be tied and left to dry in the field. Even Annie helped, collecting the grain heads that fell loose and putting them carefully into a small basket of her own. By midday, they had cut nearly half the field. The golden bundles stood in neat rows like soldiers lined up for inspection. Daniel paused to wipe sweat from his forehead and survey their progress with satisfaction. "At this rate, we'll have it all cut by tomorrow evening," he said. "Then we'll let it cure for a few days before we start threshing." Mary Ellen looked out over the field, trying to calculate the value of what they were harvesting. Even with her inexperience in estimating crop yields, she could see that this harvest would exceed their most optimistic projections. Not only would they be able to pay off their debts, but they would have enough left over to make improvements to the farm and perhaps even expand their operation. But more important than the financial security was what the harvest represented. It was proof that their partnership worked, that Daniel's expertise combined with her determination could create something sustainable and prosperous. It was evidence that taking a chance on each other had been the right decision. That evening, as they rested from the day's work, Daniel made an announcement that surprised everyone. "I rode into town this afternoon while you were resting," he said, his tone casual but his eyes twinkling with mischief. "Stopped by to see Reverend Williams and had an interesting conversation with him." Mary Ellen felt her heart skip. "What kind of conversation?" "The kind where a man asks about what it takes to arrange a wedding," Daniel replied with a grin. "Turns out the Reverend is available this Sunday afternoon, if the bride-to-be is agreeable to the timing." Tommy whooped with excitement, jumping up from his seat at the kitchen table. You're getting married, really? Annie clapped her hands together, though Mary Ellen wasn't sure the 4-year-old fully understood what marriage meant, beyond the fact that it seemed to make everyone happy. Mary Ellen felt tears spring to her eyes, but they were tears of joy. Daniel Cooper, are you proposing to me in front of my children at the kitchen table? I suppose I am, Daniel said, standing up and taking her hands in his. I know it's not very romantic, but this family is about practical love and working together, not fancy gestures. Mary Ellen Walsh, will you marry me and let me be a proper father to these children and a true partner in this life we're building? Yes, Mary Ellen whispered, then louder, yes, of course, yes. The wedding took place 3 days later, right in the wheat field where their relationship had truly begun. Reverend Williams performed the simple ceremony while Tommy and Annie stood as witnesses, along with a handful of neighbors who had come to respect Daniel's character and Mary Ellen's determination over the course of the summer. Mary Ellen wore her best dress, the blue one she had been married in the first time, but which felt appropriate for this new beginning rather than a betrayal of her first marriage. Daniel wore his cleanest shirt and had even trimmed his beard for the occasion. They exchanged simple vows, promising to work together, support each other, and care for the children as partners in all things. By the power vested in me by the territory of Nebraska, Reverend Williams announced, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Daniel kissed his new bride gently, mindful of their audience but unable to hide his joy. Tommy cheered, and Annie threw handfuls of wheat kernels like rice, creating a golden shower that caught the afternoon sunlight. The celebration was simple but perfect. Mrs. Henderson had brought a cake made with precious white sugar, and several other neighbors contributed dishes for a feast spread on tables made from planks and sawhorses. As the sun began to set, someone produced a fiddle, and there was dancing in the wheat stubble under the emerging stars. Late that night, after the guests had gone home and the children were asleep, Daniel and Mary Ellen sat on their front porch as husband and wife for the first time. The harvest was complete, the debts would be paid, and their future stretched ahead of them full of promise. Do you think Robert would approve? Mary Ellen asked softly, voicing a worry that had been in the back of her mind. Daniel considered the question seriously. I think any man who loved you and these children the way he did would want you to be happy and secure. I think he'd be glad to know that someone else values what he built here and wants to protect it. Mary Ellen leaned against her new husband's shoulder, feeling more content than she had thought possible just a few months earlier. I love you, Daniel Cooper. I love you too. Mary Ellen Cooper, he replied, the new name sounding perfect in the evening air. Years later, when people asked Mary Ellen about the day her life changed, she would smile and tell them about the morning a cowboy took her broken plow and said the words that started everything. Now rest. But what she remembered most wasn't the relief of having help with the physical work, though that had been enormous. What she remembered was the moment she realized that sometimes help comes in the form of someone who sees your struggle not as a burden to be solved, but as a life worth sharing. The farm prospered under their joint management. They added cattle the following spring, expanded their wheat acreage, and built the additional barn that Robert had dreamed of. Tommy grew into a skilled farmer and eventual owner of the land his stepfather had helped save. Annie became a teacher, but never moved far from the farm that had shaped her childhood. And every harvest season, as golden wheat waved in the Nebraska breeze, Mary Ellen would remember the summer when a stranger became family, when desperation became hope, and when the willingness to accept help transformed into the foundation for a love that lasted the rest of their lives. The field where Daniel first took the plow became known as Cooper's Acre to the family, a reminder that sometimes the best things in life come not from careful planning, but from the courage to trust a kind stranger who offers to share your burdens and build something beautiful together.